Okay, it's been a little while since we visited upon sacred geometry. A lot of times when we go through that, I want you to digest that for a while and then come back to it. I beckon you to go back through my videos on sacred geometry. There's only about 6 or so. Some are shorter, some are longer. There's one that's a multi-parter and so on. But they're pretty interesting all in themselves. In fact, one of the most interesting ones I found was where Daffy Duck, or Donald Duck, was being taught by the ancient Greeks how they knew about it. But strangely, we're going to show again today how this predates the Greeks by far, and they found out this whenever they were studying in Egypt in the Library of Alexandria and so on. In fact, it's where that eureka moment comes from. Watch my other videos on each one of these and I'll talk about them independently in those videos. But in this one here, we're talking about how to square the circle. Now, strangely, this relates to the actual size of the earth and the fact that people back way when knew the size of the earth. And we find their calculations to be extremely close. For someone just almost guessing, this actually looks to be incredibly accurate. In fact, if you look here at the top, the moon is bisected in half. We only look at half the moon. But whenever you have the earth squared off like this and utilize its squaring of the circle concept, you actually get out to the point that is just on that edge where a spacecraft at a certain speed will end up staying in our atmosphere, you know, like the space labs and satellites and things like that. If they got any closer to Earth, then they would slowly begin falling and have to raise themselves back up. They can almost get to the point of that green corner that pokes above the blue at another farther reach. And then there's a whole nother effect where you can take and roll one of these squares out and attach it to the other circle, and it damn near touches the moon within a few hundred feet. So a few of these things get pretty evident here. I'll have to mention again, like we do when we talk about sacred geometry, that geometry itself, geometer, actually is the measurement of Earth, of Mother Earth. It says that it's sacred and it's about God and it's about all these things because God created the whole universe that we have here in front of us, and so they get measurements. But due to utilizing the methods from before and this squaring off method and finding out the size of the earth, the distance of the moon itself, and how big the moon is in a ratio, there's also a showing that they know the size of the moon too, and it is 400 times farther away from us, but 400 times larger, and so it looks like it's exactly the same size during an eclipse. Pretty strange to start putting all this together, but let's take this to another level on top of that, where we can go, this simple geometry here holds the secrets to Earth and the moon. Now if we add a triangle with these exact same proportions, actually half of this square, and we take it to the medium point, or we're bisecting the square exactly in the center, I want you to see what's left over on that. You see that point there that points out the top of that? Well, that has to do with the capstone and the top of the ancient pyramids, but also this same measurement is seen in the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia. A ratio that's there that whenever they checked it out and they measured another one after they found out this fact, and they went, hey, and so they went and measured another one, they found out, oh, this is a little off. And someone said, remeasure the bottom and make sure. When they remeasured the bottom, they go, oh no, it's right on also, even though it's a different number. Strangely, that different number was a little bit less. And then there's a correlation mathematics that goes with the longitude and latitude that these things are on. whether they're down in Ur or way up at one of the other cities. And so it shows a ratio and a difference that's there, and then applying that back to the Greek pantheon and all of these different sites and this sacred geometry is built in them, suddenly people figured out, oh wow, it's all over this. And the reason this temple is this long by this wide is exactly because it's on a certain parallel too. So it's married from heaven to sky on its position relative to the equator. It's crazy. It's in my other videos. It shows it in the one that actually has to do with Donald Duck here going around with the ancient Greeks and learning things from them. But I tell you again, everything I've said in this later part predates the Greek concept of even knowing it. This comes from the pyramid itself, and even ziggurats, which are also sacredly lined up and so on too, that a lot of people don't give credit to. But let's just go on and connect this to the pyramids. You'll notice this also looks like the thing that's on the back of the dollar bill, and then there's that eye in the sky that's watching you, and then there's an idea that there's a man in the moon, and he's always facing you. He only has one face to you, and he's always watching. Now, this is the eye of Horus too, where during the day it's the eye of the sun, and then at night time it's the eye of the moon. But let's take this one step further here and connect to the moon, because whenever you get this small overlap that's left up there in that size, we use the height of the triangle as a radius to draw, and what we find is this new circle we're talking about is the same circumference as the square. And this is how that works. I had a few people on the other video where I'm going through about it and having somebody else's presentation like that, and I didn't make the statement accurate enough for people to understand, or at least a couple of people were going, that doesn't seem to come out right. That's because of the ratio that we were looking at for before and not the ratio we're looking at just then. And how that point is chopped off. But this is a depiction here of God or Jesus taking and measuring the earth, and he uses a compass when he does so, and quite often they show this concept on there, and I don't know how many people have seen this concept and then go, oh, they didn't know anything about boating, they thought the world was flat, and all of these type things. When you get taught that that's supposedly the way people thought in 1492 when people were coming to America. And the flat earth idea is talked about in the Bible as having four corners and sitting on pillars and so on. But if you look at the Sumerian representation of a map where they've shown you where Gilgamesh went and all of these things onto it, it does look round too, and then a circle around it, and it's on a flat disc. But it's not representing a flat disc at all, it's representing a sphere. In fact, that's where we get 365 degrees from, that we still have 360 degrees. So there was a belief that there was a time that the earth used to spin at 360 and everything was locked on, and it's a little bit locked off now, but that also slight variation is what gives us leap year and so on too. But not to go too deep into that, but this provides the solution that we've always been looking for on how to actually square a circle and the problem that goes along with it. And what if I told you that back in the time of Pythagoras and so on that we talk about when he's telling you that all is number, he was meaning it, that there are passages that are shown in the Bible and so on that are all hooked up to sacred geometry, certain numbers, one of which you're going to see here in a little bit, well, two of which you're going to see here in a little bit, but these concepts that came out of this idea, and that it's actually part of the Great Pyramid of Giza to show you the truth and reality of it. And in fact, the other pyramids right there with it are making other destinations and connections along with that, such as Mercury and its circle versus this versus that. We won't go into that today, but what we will look at is this thing that supposedly Pythagoras figured out, but it's not really true. This is a marriage of heaven and earth, and if we were to take the pyramid and stand it up and then take a representation of that looking down upon it, you have a variation here that's exactly the same ratio as we were looking at before in squaring the circle. So here we have again that secret of bonding heaven and earth together in sacred geometry, and it's in the Great Pyramid, which I don't know if you're aware, predates Pythagoras and all of that stuff by thousands of years, if not more. So we look at that overlapping amount, which is the same amounts on your dollar and so on again, and then there's this smaller amount that's there too versus the giant pyramid. And if you look at those little pyramids that are on the corner that are cut off by that black circle that's cutting across there, that's the same ratio of the 3 smaller pyramid satellites that are sitting in front of the Great Pyramid itself. It's crazy they have everything out to a T and know about it. And in fact, like I've told you before they had writing, they already had sacred geometry in huge numbers and even into decimal points. This has been verified due to the fact that they've shown mathematics to work with this. We've even looked at a recent thing that showed cave paintings and how they had certain dots around certain animals, and it's based on the idea of what month, what moon that would actually be under versus the switch of the year. And so not to kill off the mother and her kid before it has a chance to have a kid, and then there's 2. In fact, if she's a viable, good mother, you let her keep going and that kid, that's not the one you're killing. You're leaving that out of the situation. I feel like I'm veering off in left field here now, so let's just look at more of this concept. So they call this apothegm, and it also contains, along with this same concept, the ultimate example of sacred geometry whenever it's showing you that it is the northern hemisphere's bump. It even figures for the slight bulge that's there on the sides of the planet due to its spinning. So it's not perfected, I guess, as you'd say. But it also hooks up to the moon. I made references to this in an earlier video, probably a year and a half ago when I started getting into this. But also whenever I started talking about it, I couldn't tell you all of it at one time, or that would have ruined what I was trying to show actually in that video. And so now I want to revisit back at the same idea in this 51.84 degrees. What's that got to do with everything? Well, due to the size of the bottom of it, and why is it not exact cubits and so on either? Well, that's because the bottom plane of that is actually exactly the size of the Earth at the point that Giza is on the planet. And in fact, if you take and roll out 2 sides of the Great Pyramid, that actually equals out 1 second of arc in the spinning of our planet going around. And like when sunsets actually sunset, or whenever it does. So now that changes. The morning light or evening light changes as we get more and more and less through summer and winter. When they figure out the pivot point, though, this exactly equals to. So not only have they gone to that point, gone to the point of figuring out where the equator is and where its largest point is, then refiguring where they're at in correlation to that. By the way, it actually is pinpointed, Giza is actually pinpointed exactly on the heart of the old world and the heart of all the land masses. If you put it into a computer and you said pinpoint the middle of what all the land masses were, it seems strange to put it right on the hinge point of where Africa goes around the Mediterranean and meets the Levant and so on, but that's actually where it is. Strangely, we look at old Herodotus maps and we see the fact that they didn't really know sub-Saharan Africa exists, or did they, and they just considered it a drift off. Finding out what we found about Aslarman and so on, these people, these ancient Phoenicians, definitely knew of sub-Saharan Africa. Later it's deemed that Necho and these people actually went all the way around the Horn and all the way around the Cape and back up around and through and got back. And whenever they came back, they told them the sun was even on the other side of the ship and this, that, and the other. And they're like, well, they couldn't have gone that far because our map didn't make a reference to it. So we do have points in time here where there are references are references some people know about and other people don't whatsoever. And then whenever they find out something that would correlate with B, A is still standing here going, what? It's crazy. But it's an ultimate example of it. In fact, the top crest that's cut off there, the eye in that situation, if you were to figure back that in and then turn around and square the circle of that, you'll have the ratio of the outer circle that's shown here in the big picture and the smaller circle that's going on there. And that the moon is exactly having to do with this 1080 number that they come up with, or 108. And so it's got a connection that's being shown here, all in one. People wonder why they made them so big. Why couldn't they made it just a little smaller or just a little bigger? Well, it all goes into a ratio. From what I understand from the geeks and the computerness or whatever, it would have either been a little bigger than the smaller pyramids, but then whenever they built the small pyramids to be the satellite situation, you couldn't crawl into it and sit. You know, it'd be like the size of an igloo. It wasn't going to work. So the first representation, if you're going to put all these sizes in together and base it on the cubit, ends up being something that's exactly the size of the Great Pyramid. So they can put in the size of the Earth, the ratio of it to the moon, and all of these other factors all in one. It's pretty amazing. You know, people keep talking about how the Egyptians only had these stones to pound with and do this, that, and the other. And they talk about how they must have had grinding things somewhere. Here's a bunch of hole drills done, things like that. They usually don't talk about the fact that they already had mathematics to a point well before the pyramids showed up of this type of idea. I want you to look up somebody called Hemwinu, Hemuinu. He's the architect of the Great Pyramid. Take a look at him and see what you think about his appearance. Anyhow, so we have this ratio that's going on here, and it's the ultimate size of sacred geometry. So people have had all these questions before and everything, but in reality, this idea that we have here is shown, like I said, in Greece. It's shown in Mesopotamia. And in fact, Stonehenge itself refers to this same problem, our idea, our difference in variation, and what it really is. And then the fact that the site is made the way that it is made in a secret proportion here that connects heaven to sky in the same way. You can also find these stone circles. There's one in Egypt. There's one down in south in the Cape they call Adam's calendar. There's one that's close to Egypt out in the desert somewhat. And all of these have connections to stars and where they pass through and so on. But then the circle concept idea that goes on there, whether it's giant or smaller, all is based on a ratio that has to do with these sacred geometry numbers. In fact, let's take a little closer look here at some here, and you'll find that 39 foot, or 39.6 feet, is what's registered there, and 396 has a sacred geometry to hook up. But if you look up there at that moon, and the difference of that outer ring versus the inner ring, and that differential point, that is the little pyramid that we were talking about before, or triangle, comes out to 10.8 feet. In a ratio versus 39.6. Whenever you figure those out together, that's actually the ratio of the size of the Earth and the Moon and their differential that's there, but also making sure that we built this whole thing so this 10.8 foot works out perfectly. What does it work out perfectly to be? Well, 108 is the thing that's hooked up to the moon itself. It's the sacred geometry that goes with it, where we're talking about 1080 or 1.08 or 1080 or 10.8. It's just where you move that decimal point at. And of course, if you make something 10 times smaller than the Great Pyramid, that number will have to be 10 times smaller too, and everything get down, right? As you understand it and cut in a ratio. But 108, I even talked about it whenever I did my video on werewolves and where that comes from and why silver has to do with it and everything. Well, silver's hooked up to the moon, and the moon is hooked up with a sacred geometry number of 108. And so the moon definitely has effect on werewolves, right? It controls them, it does its things. Okay, so that's the number, that's the ratio, and That's why silver has something to do with it. The sun is gold, the moon is made of silver, and so on. Well, we know it isn't made of silver. Yeah, it's the way it looks. And the sun looks like it's made of gold. It's very shiny. You can follow along with this pretty easy. So this shows you that, not the time that I'm even showing you now, that these people knew about sacred geometry, and they pulled it into a ratio that actually hooks up the earth to the moon and the cosmos in sacred sizing, and then they turned it around upon themselves, or in actuality how they knew it really worked was that the cubit is built on the frame of a human person and a length of an arm and so on. And then there's sacred geometry all built into animals, including ourselves, and how this all hooks up to this great mystery that we have. And knowing this, they said that they were seeing the face of God, or perhaps God's mathematics, how everything's put in a certain way. Believe it or not, this ratio goes all the way down to the size of an atom too, in ratios of how much things weigh versus other things. And then I think silver's atomic weight is 1.082, and that's real strange in figuring that out, that they had this attached to the moon and then the atomic weight works to that. It doesn't work with a lot of the other elements, but it sure does with this. And in some of the papers there, it actually points it out whenever they're talking about the sacred magic and so on of ancient times, which had to do with chemistry, which is also a branch of the sciences where we figured out all these things and all the elements and how it all works out, the periodic table and all of that. So it's pretty incredible. And you can see behind him, he has spheres going on. There are ancient pictures back whenever supposedly we thought the world was flat, and there are people holding up globes, like Atlas, like Pythagoras when he's showing a globe and then a book in his other hand and so on like that. And people were, because of belief in the Bible and so on, wanted to go ahead and take and discount all these things from before that people well knew. And then of course it's pagan and it's all this type of stuff, when in reality pagan just meant agriculturist, and these agriculturist people are the people that brought all this sacred geometry to them. So to turn around, switch it a little bit, and then flop on it and act like, oh, that's all just this, but then turn around and find out that everybody, including the Bible, has these same numbers encoded all into it, shows you something that, well, that you're not really supposed to know unless you're part of the in crowd. That you'll never get it. Kind of like Jesus' parables, where he says one thing and then he comes out and says, oh, I just tell them that, so they think this and that or whatever, but they'll never really know the truth. Showing you that that's also a Gnostic type religion, where he was telling the guys, well, y'all know more than they do about the whole thing, so you get this idea, but they don't really get that idea because they haven't been taught the other part. But I guess that's for other videos to make connections with too. Let me know what you think downstairs here. This is just one more showing here, one more layer of an onion. One thing that I was in the middle of a video before was talking about, and then I was like, no, I'm just going to set that aside for later, and I'll make another video about it. And, well, here it is. Peace.